Chapter 1. The Invitation Wrapped in Snow. The winter of 1938 was a particularly bitter one in St. Mary Mead, and Miss Jane Marple found herself unusually restless. The snow had blanketed the village in a hush, muffling the usual chatter of neighbours and the clatter of carts. Her knitting needles clicked rhythmically by the fire, but her mind wandered, craving something beyond the familiar rhythms of village life. It was on such an afternoon, with a pot of tea cooling on the table, that the postman delivered an envelope that would alter her Christmas plans. The letter was embossed with the crest of the Evergreen Hotel, a grand establishment nestled in the Cotswolds, known for its opulent holiday retreats. Miss Marple's delicate fingers traced the wax seal before breaking it open. The invitation, penned in elegant script, read, "Dear Miss Marple, you are cordially invited to join us for an exclusive Christmas celebration at the Evergreen Hotel from December 23rd to December 26, 1938. Our festive gathering promises fine dining, warm company, and the charm of an English Christmas. Your presence would greatly honour us. Yours sincerely, Margaret and Charles Haverford." Proprietor's Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. She knew no Haverfords, and the invitation bore no hint of who had recommended her. "Curious," she murmured, setting the letter down. Her nephew Raymond would have called it a lark, but Miss Marple sensed something more, a thread of purpose woven into the unexpected summons. She recalled a passing mention of the Evergreen Hotel in a letter from her old friend Dolly Bantry, who had stayed there the previous summer and spoken of its peculiar charm and eclectic guests. "An invitation out of the blue is rarely without motive," she said to herself, her eyes narrowing with that familiar spark of curiosity. She sipped her tea, considering. The village was quiet, her garden dormant under snow, and the prospect of a mystery, for she was certain there was one brewing, proved irresistible. "Very well," she decided, folding the letter neatly. "I shall see what this Christmas holds." The next morning, Miss Marple sent her acceptance by post, requesting a modest room and confirming her arrival by train. She packed her valise with practical woolens, a few cherished books, and her ever-present knitting bag. As she boarded the train to the Cotswolds, the snow falling gently outside the window, she felt a tingle of anticipation. The Evergreen Hotel, she suspected, would be far more than a festive retreat. It would be a stage for secrets, and Miss Marple was never one to miss a performance. Before we move on, Detective, where in the world are you solving mysteries with us? Drop your location in the comments. And if you're craving more twisted tales, hit subscribe. Tomorrow's case file gets even darker. Stay sharp. Chapter 2. Footsteps to the Evergreen Hotel. The train to the Cotswolds chugged through a landscape of frosted hills, its whistle piercing the crisp December air. Miss Jane Marple sat by the window, her gloved hands resting on her knitting bag, watching the snowflakes dance against the glass. The journey from St. Mary Mead had been pleasant, if chilly, and the anticipation of the Evergreen Hotel grew with each mile. She had overheard two fellow passengers mention the hotel's reputation for lavish Christmases, but their hushed tones hinted at something less festive beneath the surface. As the train slowed at a small, snow-dusted station, Miss Marple gathered her belongings and stepped onto the platform. A sharp wind tugged at her scarf, and she tightened it, scanning for the promised carriage. A young man in a smart livery approached, tipping his cap. "Miss Marple, I'm Tom from the Evergreen. Carriage is this way, ma'am." The ride to the hotel was a winding affair through narrow lanes, the horses' hooves muffled by fresh snow. Tom was chatty, mentioning the Haverfords' recent renovations and the grand lot of guests expected. "Odd mix this year, though," he added almost to himself. Some right characters, if you don't mind me saying." Miss Marple smiled faintly, filing the comment away. The Evergreen Hotel loomed into view as the carriage crested a hill. A sprawling Tudor manor, its gabled roofs frosted white, windows aglow with amber light. Ivy clung to the stone walls, and a towering Christmas tree stood in the courtyard, adorned with silver bells and crimson ribbons. The sight was enchanting, yet Miss Marple's keen eyes caught a flicker of movement in an upper window, a silhouette that vanished as quickly as it appeared. Inside, the lobby was a vision of Christmas cheer. A fire roared in a massive hearth, casting shadows on oak-panelled walls hung with holly garlands. The air smelled of pine and spiced cider. A porter took her valise, and Miss Marple was greeted by a woman in her 40s, her auburn hair swept into an elegant chignon. "Miss Marple? What a delight!" the woman exclaimed, her smile warm but her eyes sharp. "I'm Margaret Haverford. Welcome to the Evergreen. My husband, Charles, is overseeing the dinner preparations, but you'll meet him soon. I trust your journey was comfortable." "Quite, thank you," Miss Marple replied, her tone polite but observant. Margaret's poise was practiced, yet there was a tightness in her voice, as if she were balancing on a delicate edge. "Your room is on the second floor," Margaret continued, leading her toward a grand staircase. "We've a full house this Christmas, writers, a retired colonel, even a film actress. I hope you'll find the company stimulating." "Oh, I'm sure I shall," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. As they ascended, she noted the polished banister, the faint creak of a floorboard, and the distant sound of laughter tinged with an edge of strain. The Evergreen Hotel, she thought, was already revealing itself as a place where facades were as carefully arranged as the decorations. Her room was cosy, with a four-poster bed and a window overlooking the snow-covered gardens. As she unpacked, Miss Marple's mind turned to Tom's remark about characters and Margaret's guarded warmth. "A stage is set," she murmured, adjusting her spectacles, "and every stage has its shadows." Chapter 3. A hostess with polished secrets, Miss Jane Marple settled into her room at the Evergreen Hotel, her knitting needles already clicking as she arranged her thoughts. The fire in her small grate crackled, casting a warm glow, but her mind was on the faint undercurrents she had sensed in the lobby. After freshening up, she donned a modest lavender dress and made her way downstairs. Drawn by the promise of tea and an opportunity to observe her hosts more closely. The drawing-room was a splendid affair, with velvet drapes and a chandelier that glittered like icicles. A long table held a silver tea service, surrounded by platters of scones and mince pies. Margaret Haverford stood near the hearth, her auburn hair catching the firelight as she conversed with a tall, broad-shouldered man in a tweed suit. This, Miss Marple deduced, must be Charles Haverford. "Miss Marple, do join us," Margaret called, her smile as polished as the silverware. "This is my husband, Charles. He's been fussing over tomorrow's Christmas dinner all day." Charles turned, his face weathered but handsome, with a moustache that twitched as he offered a firm handshake. "A pleasure, Miss Marple. Margaret tells me you're from St. Mary Mead. Quiet place, I hear. Hope our little gathering won't overwhelm you." "Not at all," Miss Marple replied, her eyes crinkling with amusement. "I find new company quite invigorating." She noted Charles's hearty tone, but caught the brief glance he exchanged with Margaret, a flicker of something unspoken, like a coded message. As she accepted a cup of tea, Miss Marple settled into a wingback chair, her vantage point perfect for observing the room. Charles was jovial, regaling a small group with tales of the hotel's history. But his laughter seemed to mask a certain weariness. Margaret, meanwhile, flitted between guests, her charm effortless yet calculated, as if she were orchestrating a delicate performance. "Margaret's outdone herself with the decorations," Charles said, gesturing to a garland of holly above the mantel. "She insists on perfection, don't you, dear?" Margaret's smile tightened. "One must keep standards, Charles. Our guests expect it." Her words were light, but Miss Marple detected a barb beneath them, as if the couple's harmony was a well-rehearsed act. A young maid, no older than 20, entered with a fresh tray of biscuits. She moved nervously, her eyes darting toward Charles before she hurried out. Miss Marple sipped her tea, filing away the maid's unease, and the way Charles's gaze lingered on the doorway. "Tell me, Mr. Haverford," Miss Marple said, her tone mild, "how did you come to choose this splendid hotel for your venture?" Charles chuckled, but his eyes were guarded. "Oh, it was Margaret's dream. I was in shipping before, made a tidy sum, but she wanted a place to call our own. The Evergreen's got history, you know. Built in 1600s, hosted nobility once. A bit of a gamble, but we've made it work." "Charles is too modest," Margaret interjected, her voice smooth. "He's the one who keeps the place running. I merely add the polish." Miss Marple nodded, her smile serene. Their words were a dance, each step practiced, but revealing cracks in their partnership. She glanced at the other guests entering the room. A stern-looking man in a military blazer. A woman in a fur stole with a theatrical air, and a bespectacled young man clutching a notebook. The stage was filling, and Miss Marple sensed the curtain was about to rise on something far more intriguing than a Christmas feast. Chapter 4. Guests with shadows behind their smiles. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in the drawing-room, her teacup balanced delicately in her hands, her eyes flitting over the guests now gathering at the Evergreen Hotel. The fire crackled, casting a warm glow, but the atmosphere held a subtle edge, like the first chill of a storm. Margaret Haverford's introductions were gracious, yet Miss Marple sensed each guest carried secrets as carefully packed as their luggage. First was Colonel Reginald Baxter, a retired military man with a bristling moustache and a voice that boomed like a cannon. He stood ramrod straight, his blazer adorned with a single medal, and spoke of his days in India with a nostalgia that bordered on obsession. "Discipline, Miss Marple," he said, catching her eye. "That's what's lacking these days. Mark my words, it'll be the ruin of us." His gaze lingered on the younger guests, disapproval etched into his frown. Next was Vivienne Laurent, a film actress whose platinum curls and fur stole screamed glamour. Her laughter was bright, but her eyes darted nervously when Charles Haverford passed by, as if she expected a script to follow. "Oh, darling, this place is divine," she cooed to Margaret, though Miss Marple noted her manicured fingers twisting a handkerchief. "But so dreadfully remote. One feels quite cut off." Then there was Ernest Whitby, a bespectacled writer in his 30s, clutching a leather notebook as if it were a lifeline. His tweed jacket was frayed at the cuffs, and his nervous smile suggested a man perpetually out of his depth. "Working on a novel," he mumbled when asked, avoiding eye contact. "Crime, you know. All the rage." Miss Marple's lips twitched. His fidgeting betrayed more than literary ambition. A latecomer arrived, drawing all eyes. Dr. Clara Henshaw, a physician with sharp features and a no-nonsense air. Her dark wool coat was practical, her handshake firm. "I don't usually do holidays," she said briskly to Margaret, "but your invitation was insistent." Miss Marple caught the pause, wondering what leverage had brought the doctor here. Finally, there was young Peter Gale, a photographer with tousled hair and a camera slung around his neck. His boyish grin was disarming, but his habit of snapping candid shots seemed to unsettle the others. "Just capturing the moment," he said when Vivian flinched at a flash. Miss Marple noted how his lens lingered on the Haverfords, as if searching for something specific. As the group mingled, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind cataloguing their interactions. Colonel Baxter's brusque dismissal of Ernest's literary chatter, Vivian's forced laughter at Charles's jokes, Clara's guarded responses to Margaret's questions. Each exchange was a thread in a tapestry of tension. The maid from earlier, now serving tea, avoided Charles entirely, her hands trembling as she poured. Margaret clapped her hands, her smile bright but strained. "Tomorrow's Christmas Eve, and we've a splendid day planned. Games, carols, and preparations for the grand dinner. I trust you'll all feel at home." "At home?" Colonel Baxter grunted. "Feels more like a stage set for one of those murder plays." The room laughed, but Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The Colonel's jest held a kernel of truth. The Evergreen Hotel was a stage, and its players were already revealing their roles. She set her teacup down, her knitting needles resuming their quiet rhythm. "A most interesting company," she murmured to herself, "and every company has its secrets." Chapter 5. Whispers Beneath the Christmas Cheer. The morning of Christmas Eve dawned crisp and bright, with sunlight glinting off the snow that blanketed the Evergreen Hotel's grounds. Miss Jane Marple stood at her window, her breath fogging the glass as she surveyed the frosted gardens below. The festive cheer promised by the Haverfords was in full swing. Guests were already gathering for morning coffee in the dining hall. But Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the undercurrents she had sensed the previous evening. Descending to the hall, she found the guests in high spirits, though the air crackled with subtle tensions. The long oak table was laden with pastries and steaming coffee pots, and a gramophone played soft carols in the corner. Margaret Haverford bustled about, directing staff with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Charles, meanwhile, was deep in conversation with Colonel Baxter, their voices low and urgent, until they noticed Miss Marple's approach and shifted to discussing the weather. Miss Marple settled near the fireplace, her knitting in hand, positioning herself to overhear snatches of conversation. Vivienne Laurent, draped in a silk shawl, was regaling Ernest Whitby with tales of her latest film, though her laughter faltered when Peter Gale's camera flashed nearby. "Must you? Darling," she snapped, her tone sharper than intended. Peter grinned, unperturbed. "Just capturing the festive spirit, Miss Laurent." Dr. Clara Henshaw sat apart, reading a medical journal, but Miss Marple noticed her glance up whenever Margaret passed by, her expression unreadable. Ernest, meanwhile, scribbled furiously in his notebook, pausing only to cast nervous glances at Charles. The young maid from yesterday, whom Miss Marple now knew as Lily, moved silently among the guests, her eyes downcast but her ears clearly attuned to the chatter. As coffee was cleared away, Margaret announced a morning of parlour games in the library. Miss Marple joined the group, her mild demeanour masking her keen interest. During a lively round of charades, she overheard a whispered exchange between Charles and Vivienne behind a bookcase. "You promised it was sorted," Vivienne hissed, her voice barely audible. Charles's reply was curt. "Keep your voice down. It will be." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind filing away the fragment. Later, as the group dispersed for a stroll in the gardens, Miss Marple lingered near the library's bay window. She spotted Lily outside, speaking heatedly with Peter Gale near a snow-covered hedge. Their words were lost to the wind, but Lily's flushed cheeks and Peter's placating gestures suggested a disagreement. When Lily noticed Miss Marple watching, she hurried back inside, leaving Peter to adjust his camera with a frown. By afternoon, the hotel buzzed with preparations for the Christmas Eve festivities. Miss Marple volunteered to help arrange holly wreaths, using the task to observe the staff. Lily's nervous glances toward the Haverfords were unmistakable, and a footman named Thomas seemed equally on edge, avoiding Charles entirely. "A house full of secrets," Miss Marple murmured, her fingers deftly tying a ribbon, "and secrets like snow have a way of piling up before they melt." As evening approached, the promise of carols and a lavish supper loomed, but Miss Marple's thoughts were on the whispers she had collected. Each was a thread in a tangled web, and she suspected the Christmas dinner tomorrow would pull them taut. With a quiet smile, she tucked her knitting away, ready to watch the next act unfold. Chapter 6. Preparations laced with tension. The afternoon of Christmas Eve at the Evergreen Hotel was a flurry of activity, the air thick with the scent of roasting chestnuts and pine. Miss Jane Marple, ever unobtrusive, joined the guests in the main hall, where preparations for the evening's festivities were in full swing. Servants bustled about, polishing silver candelabras and arranging poinsettias, while Margaret Haverford directed with the precision of a conductor. Yet, Miss Marple noted, her commands carried a brittle edge, as if the weight of perfection was wearing thin. The guests were roped into light tasks to foster holiday spirit. Colonel Baxter, with a gruff sense of duty, helped hang garlands, though he muttered about frivolous nonsense. Vivienne Laurent, ever the performer, draped tinsel with theatrical flourishes, drawing admiring glances from Ernest Whitby, who seemed torn between his notebook and her charm. Dr. Clara Henshaw, however, declined to participate, citing a headache, though Miss Marple saw her slip into the library with a purposeful stride. Peter Gale darted about, his camera clicking, capturing moments that seemed to unsettle more than delight. Miss Marple volunteered to assist Lily, the young maid, with setting out place cards for the Christmas dinner. As they worked, she observed Lily's trembling hands and downcast eyes. "You seem troubled, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, folding a napkin. "Is the holiday rush too much?" Lily started, nearly dropping a card. "Oh, no, Mum. Just lots to do." Her voice was strained, and she glanced toward the kitchen, where Charles Haverford was inspecting a tray of mince pies. Miss Marple followed her gaze, noting Charles's brusque manner with the cook, a contrast to his usual geniality. A sudden clatter from the far end of the hall drew their attention. Thomas, the footman, had dropped a tray of crystal glasses. His face flushed as Charles approached with a sharp word. "Clumsy fool!" Charles muttered, loud enough for Miss Marple to hear. Thomas mumbled an apology and fled, leaving Margaret to smooth over the incident with a forced laugh. "Just a small mishap, nothing to spoil the cheer." As the afternoon waned, Miss Marple joined a group decorating the grand Christmas tree in the dining hall. Peter Gale, ever present with his camera, offered her a star ornament. "You've got a sharp eye, Miss Marple," he said, his grin boyish, but his tone probing. "Notice anything out of place?" She smiled serenely. "Only that people are rarely as cheerful as they seem, Mr. Gale." His grin faltered, and she wondered what his lens had captured that he wasn't sharing. By dusk the hotel glowed with candlelight, and the promise of a festive supper filled the air. Yet Miss Marple's thoughts were on the small incidents of the day. Lily's fear, Thomas's clumsiness, Clara's absence, and the Haverfords' strained harmony. Each was a piece of a puzzle, and she sensed the picture was about to take a darker turn. As the guests retired to dress for the evening, Miss Marple lingered, her knitting in hand. Preparations, she mused, her needles clicking softly, are not only for dinners, but for secrets to be unveiled. The stage was set, and she was ready for the next curtain to rise. Chapter 7. A Shadow on Christmas Eve. The Christmas Eve supper at the Evergreen Hotel was a splendid affair, with candlelit tables and the soft strains of Silent Night from the gramophone. Yet, as Miss Jane Marple took her seat among the guests, her keen eyes caught flickers of unease beneath the festive veneer. The dining hall gleamed with polish, but the atmosphere held a tension that no amount of holly could dispel. The meal progressed smoothly at first, roast goose, plum pudding, and mulled wine sparking lively chatter. Colonel Baxter recounted tales of Christmas in Calcutta, while Vivian Laurent's laughter rang out, though Miss Marple noted her glances toward Charles. Haverford were more guarded than merry. Ernest Whitby scribbled in his notebook between bites, murmuring about inspiration, while Dr. Clara Henshaw ate sparingly, her sharp eyes scanning the room. Peter Gale, camera absent for once, seemed unusually subdued, his usual grin replaced by a thoughtful frown. As dessert was served, Miss Marple excused herself briefly, citing a need to fetch her shawl. In truth, she wished to explore the hotel's quieter corners. The corridors were dim, lit only by flickering sconces, and the air was heavy with the scent of wax and pine. As she passed the library, she heard raised voices, a man and a woman, their words muffled but heated. "You can't keep dodging this," the woman snapped, her voice low but fierce. Miss Marple recognized Vivian's theatrical cadence. The man's reply, Charles, she was certain, was curt. "Not here! Not now!" The conversation cut off as footsteps approached, and Miss Marple slipped behind a curtain, her heart steady, but her curiosity aflame. Emerging moments later, she continued down the hall, only to pause at a faint creak from above. A shadow moved along the upper landing, a figure too fleeting to identify, but its stealth suggested purpose. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Shadows, in her experience, often preceded revelations. Returning to the dining hall, she found the mood shifted. Lily, the maid, was clearing plates with a trembling hand, her face pale as she avoided Charles's gaze. Margaret, ever the poised hostess, was reassuring Ernest about a spilled wineglass, but her eyes darted toward her husband with a flicker of irritation. Colonel Baxter, meanwhile, was arguing with Peter about the merits of modern photography, his voice loud enough to mask quieter exchanges. As the evening wound down, the guests were invited to the drawing-room for carols. Miss Marple lingered, watching as Thomas, the footman, slipped out a side door, his expression troubled. She made a mental note to speak with him later. His unease was too pronounced to ignore. By the fire, as Vivian led a shaky rendition of "O Come, All Ye Faithful," Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. The voices in the library, the shadow on the landing, the nervous glances of the staff, all were threads in a tightening web. "Shadows cast long webs," she murmured, her knitting needles resuming their rhythm, "and webs, once spun, ensnare." The night was young, but Miss Marple knew the true drama of the Evergreen Hotel was only beginning. Chapter 8. Morning Gifts and Hidden Glances. Christmas morning at the Evergreen Hotel dawned with a quiet radiance, the snow outside sparkling under a pale sun. Miss Jane Marple rose early, her breath visible in the chilly room as she dressed in a sensible wool skirt and cardigan. From her window, she watched the grounds come alive with activity. Servants clearing paths, guests venturing out for brisk walks. But her mind was on the shadows and whispers of the previous night. Downstairs, the dining hall was transformed into a festive tableau. A towering Christmas tree stood adorned with glass baubles and tinsel, and a long table held gifts wrapped in bright paper. Margaret Haverford, impeccable in a green velvet dress, greeted the guests with a smile that seemed to strain under the weight of her duties. "Merry Christmas, Miss Marple," she called, handing her a small parcel. "A token from us all." The gift was a delicate silver brooch shaped like a holly leaf, charming but impersonal. Miss Marple thanked her, noting Margaret's quick glance toward Charles, who was distributing cigars to Colonel Baxter and Ernest Whitby. The Colonel accepted his with a grunt, while Ernest fumbled, nearly dropping his notebook. Vivienne Laurent, resplendent in a scarlet gown, unwrapped a silk scarf with a theatrical gasp, though her eyes lingered on Charles with a flicker of unease. Dr. Clara Henshaw received a leather-bound book, her expression cool as she murmured thanks. Peter Gale, unwrapping a new camera lens, grinned broadly. But Miss Marple caught him exchanging a sharp look with Lily, the maid who was serving coffee. The gift exchange was merry on the surface, but Miss Marple's keen eyes spotted cracks. Lily's hands shook as she poured, and Thomas, the footman, avoided the room entirely, his absence noted only by a tightening of Margaret's lips. When Peter attempted to photograph the group, Vivian turned away sharply, and Colonel Baxter barked, "Enough of that blasted flashing!" Peter lowered his camera, but not before capturing Clara's frown. After breakfast, the guests were invited to join a snowball fight in the garden, a light-hearted diversion Miss Marple declined, preferring to observe from the conservatory. She watched as Charles and Vivian lingered near a frozen fountain, their conversation brief but intense. "It's too late for regrets," Charles said, his voice carrying faintly. Vivian's reply was inaudible, but her gesture, a sharp turn away, spoke volumes. Inside, Miss Marple found Ernest alone in the library, scribbling furiously. "Inspiration strikes at odd times, doesn't it?" she remarked, her tone mild. Ernest started, slamming his notebook shut. "Just plotting, Miss Marple. A murder mystery, you know." His laugh was nervous, and she smiled, wondering what truths his fiction concealed. As noon approached, the hotel buzzed with anticipation for the grand Christmas dinner. Miss Marple returned to her room to freshen up, her thoughts on the morning's observations, Lily's fear, Vivian's tension, Ernest's secrecy, and the Haverford's strained unity. "Gifts reveal more than gratitude," she mused, pinning the holly brooch to her cardigan. "And this Christmas is unwrapping something dangerous." Chapter 9. A Feast Set for Trouble. The Christmas dinner at the Evergreen Hotel was a spectacle of elegance, the dining hall transformed into a vision of festivity. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over tables draped in crimson linen, adorned with silver candelabras and sprigs of holly. The scent of roast turkey and spiced wine filled the air, and a string quartet played softly in the corner, their notes weaving through the hum of conversation. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the head of the table, adjusted her spectacles, her serene smile masking the keen observation of every glance and gesture. Margaret Haverford, resplendent in emerald silk, presided over the gathering with practised grace, though Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in her hand, as she raised a glass for the opening toast. "To a Merry Christmas and cherished company," she said, her voice bright, but her eyes scanning the guests with a hint of wariness. Charles, at her side, echoed the toast, his hearty tone not quite concealing a tightness in his jaw. The guests were a colourful assembly. Colonel Baxter, in a formal dinner jacket, sat stiffly, his eyes darting to the servants as if expecting a military inspection. Vivienne Laurent, her scarlet gown catching the candlelight, laughed too loudly at Charles's jests, her fingers clutching her wine-glass. Ernest Whitby, fidgeting with his tie, scribbled occasional notes under the table, his nervous glances flitting toward Margaret. Dr. Clara Henshaw, in a severe black dress, ate methodically, her sharp gaze missing nothing. Peter Gale, camera absent but eyes alight with curiosity, seemed to study each guest as if framing a shot. The first course, oyster soup, was served by Lillian Thomas, both moving with the careful precision of those under scrutiny. Miss Marple caught Lily's fleeting look of panic as Charles leaned to whisper something to Margaret, and Thomas's stiff posture as he passed Vivian's chair. The soup was exquisite, yet the table's chatter felt strained, punctuated by awkward silences. "Delightful setting, Mrs. Haverford," Miss Marple said, her tone mild. "You've outdone yourself." Margaret's smile was tight. "Thank you, Miss Marple. We aim to make every Christmas memorable." Her words were polite, but Miss Marple sensed a double meaning, as if memory itself were a burden. As the main course arrived, turkey with all the trimmings, Colonel Baxter launched into a story about a Christmas campaign in Burma, his voice drowning out the quartet. Vivian interrupted with a theatrical sigh. "Must we talk of war, Colonel? It's Christmas." Her tone was playful, but her eyes held a flicker of desperation. Peter leaned forward, his grin sly. "Oh, I don't know, Miss Laurent. A good story's got conflict, hasn't it, Mr. Whitby?" Ernest flushed, nearly spilling his wine. "I suppose," he mumbled, his pen pausing. Miss Marple sipped her water, her mind cataloguing the interplay. Vivian's unease, Ernest's secrecy, the Haverfords' tension, each was a note in a discordant symphony. As the quartet struck up "Hark, the herald angels sing," she felt a prickle of foreboding. The dinner was only beginning, but the stage was set for something far darker than a festive feast. Chapter 10. The Toast That Turned to Terror. The Christmas dinner at the Evergreen Hotel reached its crescendo as the main course gave way to a decadent array of desserts. Plum pudding aflame with brandy, mince pies, and crystal goblets of mulled wine. The string quartet's melodies softened, and the candlelight cast long shadows across the dining hall. Miss Jane Marple, seated with a clear view of the table, noted the guests' shifting moods, laughter growing brittle, glances sharpening with unspoken suspicions. Charles Haverford rose, his broad frame commanding attention as he tapped a spoon against his glass. The room fell silent, all eyes on him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice rich but strained, "before we indulge in these splendid sweets, I propose a toast to new beginnings, old secrets, and the magic of Christmas." The words hung oddly in the air, and Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Old secrets was a curious choice, and she saw Vivian Laurent's hand tighten around her goblet, her painted lips parting slightly. Colonel Baxter raised his glass with a grunt, while Ernest Whitby fumbled his splashing wine onto his napkin. Dr. Clara Henshaw's expression remained impassive, but her fingers tapped the table. Peter Gale lifted his glass with a wry smile, his eyes locked on Charles. Margaret Haverford stood to join the toast, her emerald gown shimmering. "To our guests," she added, her smile tight, whose presence makes this night unforgettable." She raised her goblet, and the guests followed suit, the clink of crystal echoing. As they drank, a sudden gasp shattered the moment. Vivienne Laurent clutched her throat, her goblet slipping from her hand to shatter on the floor. Her face contorted, eyes wide with panic as she staggered back, collapsing into her chair. "Poison!" she choked out, her voice a rasp before she slumped, motionless. Chaos erupted. Colonel Baxter leapt to his feet, barking orders as if on a battlefield. Ernest dropped his notebook, his face ashen. Peter lunged toward Vivienne, but Dr. Clara Henshaw was faster, kneeling beside her, checking her pulse with clinical precision. "She's dead," Clara announced, her voice steady but grim. Margaret's scream cut through the din, her hands trembling as she gripped Charles's arm. "How could this happen?" she cried, her composure shattered. Charles stood frozen, his face pale, eyes darting to the broken goblet. Miss Marple remained seated, her knitting untouched in her lap, her mind racing. She noted Lily's horrified gasp from the corner, Thomas's absence from the room, and the way Peter's hands shook as he stepped back. The quartet had stopped, the silence heavy with shock. "Stay calm, everyone," Clara said, rising. "No one touch the glass or the wine. We need to preserve everything." Colonel Baxter rounded on Charles. "What's the meaning of this, Haverford? Poison in your hotel? Someone's responsible." Charles opened his mouth, but no words came. Margaret clutched his arm tighter, her eyes wild. Miss Marple's gaze swept the table, the spilled wine, the scattered dessert plates, the guests' stunned faces. "A toast to secrets," she murmured to herself, "and one has just been unveiled." The festive night had turned deadly, and Miss Marple knew the true work of Christmas had begun. Chapter 11. Snowbound in a House of Suspects. The dining hall of the Evergreen Hotel, moments ago a scene of festive splendour, now felt like a stage frozen mid-act. Vivienne Laurent's lifeless form slumped in her chair, the shattered goblet at her feet glinting in the candlelight. Miss Jane Marple sat calmly, her hands folded over her knitting, her eyes sharp as she observed the chaos unfolding. The string quartet stood silent, their instruments abandoned, while the guests' voices rose in a cacophony of shock and accusation. Colonel Baxter's booming voice cut through the din. "This is outrageous! Haverford, explain yourself! Poison at your table?" His face was red, his medal gleaming as he pointed at Charles. Charles, pale and unsteady, raised his hands. I don't know how this happened. The wine was from our cellar, checked myself." His eyes flicked to Margaret, who stood rigid, her hands clenched. Dr. Clara Henshaw, still kneeling by Vivienne, looked up sharply. "No one leaves this room until we understand what happened. The goblet and wine must be examined." Her tone was authoritative, but Miss Marple noted a flicker of unease in her eyes. Margaret's voice trembled as she addressed the guests. "Please, everyone, stay calm. We'll get to the bottom of this." But her words faltered as a gust of wind rattled the windows, drawing all eyes to the storm outside. Snow swirled furiously, piling against the glass. Peter Gale, his usual grin absent, peered out. "Looks like a blizzard. No one's going anywhere tonight." Miss Marple rose, her movements deliberate. "Perhaps someone could check the telephone?" she suggested mildly. Thomas, the footman, who had reappeared looking ashen, hurried to comply. Moments later he returned, shaking his head. "Line's dead, ma'am. Snow must have brought it down." A collective murmur rippled through the room. The Evergreen Hotel, isolated by the storm, was now a locked cage. Ernest Whitby clutched his notebook, his voice barely a whisper. "Trapped with a murderer." "Nonsense," Charles snapped. but his bravado was thin. It could have been an accident. Bad wine, perhaps. Clara scoffed. Bad wine doesn't cause convulsions like that. It was poison, and deliberate. Her eyes swept the room, lingering on each guest. Miss Marple's gaze followed Clara's, noting the reactions. Lily, the maid, hovered near the door, her face pale as she avoided Charles's glance. Peter's hands fidgeted, his eyes darting to the broken goblet. Colonel Baxter stood rigid, his fists clenched, while Ernest scribbled furiously, as if documenting his own fear. Margaret, regaining some composure, clapped her hands. We'll move to the drawing room. The staff will secure this area until we can investigate properly. Her voice was firm, but Miss Marple caught the tremor in it. As the guests shuffled out, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes on the goblet's shards. The wine had spread across the floor, mingling with a stray holly leaf from the table's centerpiece. A locked hotel, she murmured, and a poison that unlocks secrets. She tucked her knitting into her bag, her mind already sifting through the threads of motive and opportunity. The storm had trapped them, but it had also trapped the killer, and Miss Marple was determined to find them. Chapter 12. Alibis Woven with Lies. The drawing room of the Evergreen Hotel was a stark contrast to the festive dining hall, its heavy drapes and flickering firelight casting an oppressive gloom. The guests sat in uneasy clusters, their faces etched with suspicion, as the reality of Vivian Laurent's murder settled over them. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a corner with her knitting, observed the group with her usual quiet intensity, her needles clicking softly as she pieced together the evening's events. Colonel Baxter broke the silence, his voice sharp. "Someone here poisoned that woman, and I'll not sit idly by. Haverford, what do you know about this?" He glared at Charles, who stood by the hearth, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. "I've told you, Colonel. I know nothing," Charles snapped, his face flushed. "The wine was fine, served to everyone. Why her?" His eyes darted to Margaret, who sat rigid, her hands twisting a lace handkerchief. Dr. Clara Henshaw, standing near a bookcase, crossed her arms. The poison was fast-acting, likely cyanide, given the symptoms. It was in her goblet, not the shared wine. Someone targeted her specifically. Her clinical tone did little to ease the tension. Miss Marple spoke up, her voice gentle but firm. "If I may, Dr. Henshaw, could anyone have tampered with Miss Laurent's goblet during the dinner?" All eyes turned to her, some with surprise, others with wariness. Clara nodded. "It's possible." The table was crowded, and the staff were moving about. A quick hand could have done it unnoticed. Peter Gale, slouched in an armchair, raised an eyebrow. "So we're pointing fingers at the staff now, or each other?" His tone was light, but his eyes flicked toward Lily, who stood near the door, her face pale. Miss Marple turned to Lily. "My dear, you served the wine, didn't you? Did you notice anything unusual?" Lily's eyes widened, and she shook her head frantically. "No, ma'am. I just poured as I was told. I didn't see nothing." Her voice cracked, and she glanced at Charles, who looked away. Margaret interjected, her voice sharp. "Lily's been with us for years. She's trustworthy." But Miss Marple noted the defensive edge, as if Margaret were shielding more than the maid's reputation. Colonel Baxter snorted. "What about you, Whitby? Always scribbling in that notebook, writing down alibis, are you?" Ernest flinched, clutching his notebook tighter. I was just taking notes for my novel, nothing more." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "And you, Mr. Gale? Your camera captures so much. Did it capture anything telling tonight?" Peter's grin faltered. "Didn't have it at dinner, Miss Marple. Too busy eating. but his fingers tapped nervously on the armrest. She turned to Charles. "Mr. Haverford, you were near Miss Laurent during the toast. Did you see anyone approach her goblet?" Charles hesitated, his jaw tightening. "No, I was focused on the toast. It all happened so fast." Margaret's hand grazed his arm, a subtle gesture that Miss Marple didn't miss. As accusation swirled, Miss Marple's mind worked through the alibis. Lily's fear, Peter's evasiveness, Ernest's secrecy, the Haverfords' tension. Each was a thread, but none yet formed the full pattern. The poison had been deliberate, and the killer was among them. Their alibi as fragile as the snow outside. "Lies unravel like poor knitting," she murmured, her needles steady. "One tug, and the truth comes loose." Chapter 13. The clue the killer forgot. The snowstorm raged outside the Evergreen Hotel, sealing the guests and staff in a cocoon of suspicion. In the drawing room, the air was thick with unease as accusations hung unresolved. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting needles idle for once, stood near the window, her gaze alternating between the swirling snow and the tense faces around her. Vivian Laurent's murder had cracked the facade of festive cheer, and Miss Marple knew the key to unravelling the mystery lay in a detail overlooked. Dr. Clara Henshaw had taken charge, insisting the dining hall remain untouched until morning, when the storm might allow for a constable's arrival. But Miss Marple, with her knack for seeing what others missed, felt the truth was closer at hand. "Might I suggest," she said, her voice soft but carrying, "that we examine the dining hall ourselves? A small detail may shed light." Colonel Baxter scoffed. "What could an old lady find that we haven't?" But Clara nodded, intrigued. "It's worth a look. No one's to touch anything, though." The group returned to the dining hall, where Vivian's body had been respectfully covered with a tablecloth. The shattered goblet still lay on the floor, its wine staining the wood. Miss Marple moved slowly, her eyes scanning the table, plates, cutlery, the holly centerpiece. She paused at Vivian's place, noting the scattered holly leaves and a faint smudge on the tablecloth. "Curious," she murmured, bending closer. The smudge was a faint blue mark, barely visible, like ink or dye. She glanced at Ernest Whitby, who clutched his notebook tightly, his pen tucked into his pocket. "Mr. Whitby, do you use blue ink?" Ernest started, his face paling. Yes, but what's that got to do with anything?" His voice was defensive, and Miss Marple noted Peter Gale's sudden interest. She turned to Lily, who hovered nervously. "My dear, when you poured the wine, did you handle Miss Laurent's goblet differently?" Lily shook her head, but her eyes flicked to Charles, who stood rigid by Margaret. Miss Marple's gaze returned to the table, landing on a small, overlooked item, a silver spoon, slightly askew near Vivian's plate. She picked it up carefully, noting a faint residue on its handle, the same blue tinge as the tablecloth. "This spoon," she said, holding it up, "was not used for dessert, yet it's marked. Could it have held the poison?" Clara frowned, examining it. "Possibly. Cyanide could be concealed in a small amount, slipped into the wine." Her eyes narrowed at Charles. "You were closest to her during the toast." Charles bristled. "Are you accusing me? I'd no reason to harm her." Margaret's hand gripped his arm, her face pale. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Not accusing, Mr. Haverford, merely observing." She turned to Peter. "Your photographs, Mr. Gale. Did any capture the table before the toast?" Peter hesitated, then nodded. "I might have one. From earlier." He retrieved his camera from his room, producing a print that showed the table mid-dinner. The spoon was missing from Vivian's place. The room fell silent, the weight of the clues sinking in. Someone had placed the spoon there, and the blue residue linked it to a specific hand. Miss Marple's mind raced, connecting the ink, the spoon, and the whispers she'd overheard. The killer's motive was crystallizing, and the final act was near.